The cabin hummed with quiet anticipation as passengers settled into their seats, but the calm didn't last long. A sharp yet composed voice sliced through the air. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'll need to ask you to move to the rear." All eyes turned as a flight attendant in crisp uniform stood over a poised woman seated in first class. The woman, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, didn't argue. She simply gathered her belongings, rose with quiet grace, and made her way down the aisle. What no one on that flight knew, not even the attendant, was that in exactly 4 minutes, everything would change. Before we dive into this unexpected twist, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're ready for a story that will leave you speechless, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The airport pulsed with the familiar energy of a bustling travel hub. Luggage wheels rolled across the floors, conversations mingled with the occasional overhead announcement, and lines of travelers snaked patiently through security and boarding gates. At Gate 17, Alina Foster moved through the crowd with an effortless calm. She was the kind of woman people noticed without quite knowing why. Her pale pink blazer and tailored slacks set her apart, as did the way she carried herself, not rushed, but deliberate, as if she belonged everywhere she went. A few fellow travelers exchanged nods with her as she passed, drawn to her warm, easy smile. Elena, however, kept to herself. When boarding began, Alina approached the gate agent, handing over her ticket with a gentle nod. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said with a polite smile. "Thank you," Alina replied softly as she stepped onto the jet bridge, the soft click of her heels echoing off the metal. At the entrance of the aircraft, 2 flight attendants greeted her. "Welcome aboard," one said cheerfully. Elena nodded in return and slipped inside, making her way to a window seat in the first-class cabin. She placed her leather handbag in the overhead bin, taking her time to ensure everything was neatly arranged before settling into her seat. Her gaze drifted lightly around the cabin, watching as other passengers trickled in. Not long after, a tall man in a sleek charcoal suit stepped aboard. His sharp features and confident stride turned heads, but he barely glanced around. His eyes briefly met Elena's, and for a fleeting second, something unspoken seemed to pass between them. Then he shifted away, settling into a seat at the front of the cabin. No one paid the moment much attention. The last few passengers filed in as a flight attendant named Rachel Hayes made her way down the aisle, clipboard in hand. Her steps were quick, and her face, though composed, held a flicker of tension. Midway through the cabin, Rachel's eyes stopped abruptly, locking onto Alina. She frowned, scanning her seating chart with more scrutiny than before. Rachel approached slowly, her smile tight. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said with measured politeness. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Elena looked up, calm but curious. Without hesitation, she retrieved the pass from her pocket and handed it over. Rachel's eyes flickered as she examined it. A small crease appeared on her brow. "It looks like there's been a mistake," Rachel murmured, lowering her voice slightly. "This seat is reserved for another passenger. I'll need to move you to a different one." Elena's lips pressed into a faint but steady smile. "There's no mistake," she replied evenly. "This is the seat I booked." Rachel hesitated, shifting uncomfortably as the first few passengers began to notice the exchange. Soft murmurs rippled through the cabin. "Perhaps you intended to select a seat in the main cabin," Rachel suggested, though her tone, while polite, was edged with something firmer. Elena's gaze didn't waver. Her voice, though soft, carried weight. "No," she said simply. "This is the seat I reserved." The tension thickened, drawing curious glances from other rows. Rachel's cheeks flushed lightly, but she squared her shoulders. "I can offer you a seat toward the back," she insisted, gesturing behind her. "It's just as comfortable." Elena remained composed. "I'd prefer to stay here," she replied, her tone unwavering. The small but growing audience watched intently. Rachel shifted again, feeling the weight of their stares. Still, she pressed forward, though her smile was tighter than before. "I'm afraid I must insist," Rachel said quietly, leaning in slightly. "Please, gather your things." Elena's steps were slow and composed as she lifted her bag, stepping into the aisle. As she moved toward the rear of the plane, her gaze caught the man in the charcoal suit. He was watching her now, his expression carefully neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. something he chose not to voice. Elena held her head high, gliding past rows of curious onlookers. Whispers trailed behind her, blending curiosity, quiet judgment, and discomfort. She slipped into her new seat near the back, gazing out the window, her face calm but her thoughts racing. At the front, Rachel Hayes adjusted her blazer with a slight tug, feeling relief wash over her. The situation had been handled, or so she believed. She pressed on with her duties, unaware of the undercurrents swirling around her decision. The cabin settled into a rhythmic hum. Passengers shifted in their seats, the clinking of seatbelts and soft thud of closing overhead bins filling the space. Rachel stood tall, her professional mask firmly in place as she began the pre-flight safety demonstration. Though her outward poise had returned, a faint glimmer of satisfaction lingered just beneath the surface. Despite herself, Rachel's eyes drifted toward the back, searching for Elena. There she sat, composed and unreadable, her posture upright and dignified. Though she appeared undisturbed, there was something about Elena's quiet stillness that seemed to press against the air itself. Up front, the man in the charcoal suit reclined in his seat, but his gaze occasionally flickered toward the rear of the plane. His expression remained impassive, but there was a quiet intensity to him, every glance, every shift deliberate and precise. Passengers whispered. Some speculated in hushed tones. Who was he? A public figure? A high-powered executive? His presence carried weight, yet no one could place the connection between him and the woman now sitting at the back. Rachel continued her rounds, double-checking the cabin before takeoff. As she passed the man's seat, he raised his hand slightly, catching her attention with a subtle but unmistakable authority. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth yet firm. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Rachel's posture straightened, her professionalism snapping into place. "Of course, sir," she replied quickly, her tone respectful. In the galley, she poured the water, but as she did, her gaze drifted toward the back of the plane. The image of Elena, now seated quietly, pulled at her thoughts in a way she couldn't quite explain. Rachel returned, carefully handing the man his drink. He accepted it with a polite nod, but just as she turned to leave, his voice halted her. "The woman you moved," he said casually, though there was a distinct sharpness beneath his calm. His eyes flickered subtly toward the rear. "What was the issue?" Rachel froze, cheeks warming slightly. She quickly scanned the surrounding passengers, ensuring no one was within earshot, and leaned in. "Oh, it wasn't anything serious," she said, keeping her tone light. She seemed confused about her seat. "I thought it best to handle it quietly." The man's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Confused, you say?" His words were measured, but Rachel sensed the weight behind them. "Yes, sir," Rachel replied, feeling a sudden tightness in her chest. "Just a simple misunderstanding." He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes steady and unblinking. Finally, he gave a slow nod and leaned back. "Interesting," he murmured, dismissing her with a subtle shift in posture. Rachel hesitated for half a breath, then excused herself, retreating to the galley with a nervous energy she couldn't shake. At the rear, Elena sat quietly, her gaze resting on the window as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Her hands lay lightly in her lap, her demeanor outwardly calm, yet beneath the surface, she was fully aware of the silent game now unfolding. The engines roared to life, vibrating beneath the cabin as the aircraft accelerated. Passengers braced as the plane lifted into the sky, the ground shrinking beneath them. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the familiar sensation of ascent wash over her. When she exhaled, her expression was serene, but fragments of the previous encounter lingered. Rachel's tense voice, the quiet murmurs, and the sharp, lingering gaze of the man in first class. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, the cabin eased into the steady rhythm of mid-flight. Conversations resumed, accompanied by the soft hum of the beverage cart beginning its rounds. The soft clinking of beverage carts filled the cabin as Rachel continued her rounds, though her steps were a little stiffer now. Her usual smooth efficiency carried a hint of hesitation. The exchange with the man in the charcoal suit lingered in her mind. Up in first class, the man remained quiet, scrolling through emails on his phone with practiced ease. His calm exterior gave nothing away, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every so often, his gaze drifted toward the rear of the plane, his expression darkening slightly. He had noticed the subtle glances from passengers as Elena made her way to the back. The quiet judgment, the lingering curiosity, none of it had escaped his attention. But he had chosen not to speak. Timing was everything. Rachel carried on with her tasks, but she carefully avoided eye contact with Elena as she passed by the rear section. Yet Elena saw her. She noticed everything. Her gaze, soft but sharp, lingered on Rachel just long enough for the flight attendant to feel it. Elena didn't need words to command attention. Her silence had always been enough. A sudden jolt of turbulence rattled the cabin, drawing soft gasps from a few passengers. Elena's hand instinctively gripped the armrest, but her composure returned almost immediately. She released her grip, her expression unwavering. Across the aisle, a woman sitting nearby leaned over, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. "Excuse me," the woman began cautiously. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. The seat that seemed unnecessary." Elena turned, meeting her gaze with a soft, understanding smile. "Sometimes," Elena said quietly, "people make assumptions." Her voice was gentle, but the weight in her words carried deeper meaning. The woman flushed slightly, her eyes lowering in embarrassment. "Well, I just thought you handled it with grace," she replied. "I'm not sure I would have been as calm." Elena inclined her head in quiet thanks, but said nothing more. The brief conversation left a mark, and the woman returned to her seat, thoughtful. At the front of the cabin, the man in the suit rose from his seat. He stretched casually, his movements unhurried, just another passenger stretching his legs. But as he began walking down the aisle, his eyes scanned each row until they found Elena. A faint smile tugged at his lips, one that blended quiet affection with something more, something resolute. Passengers watched him as he moved, their curiosity rekindled. Who was he? Why did he seem so familiar with the woman seated near the back? When he reached Elena's row, he stopped, bending slightly to meet her eye level. "Everything all right?" His voice was soft, carrying warmth, but also the subtle weight of concern. Elena looked up, her lips curving into a small smile. "Of course," she replied gently. "I'm fine." The moment passed in silence, but it was enough to stir murmurs among the nearby passengers. Rachel, from her position near the front, froze mid-step. Her eyes locked onto the man speaking to Elena, and suddenly the pieces began falling into place. A chill rippled through her as realization crept in. She gripped the handle of the service cart a little tighter, her pulse quickening. Who was he? And why did he seem so at ease with the woman she had quietly ushered to the back of the plane? Rachel's gaze lingered, but when the man straightened and adjusted his jacket, his eyes swept over the rows nearby. There was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself, a presence that seemed to hush the surrounding whispers without him needing to say a word. "If you need anything," he said to Elena, his voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear, "let me know." Elena nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. The man turned and began walking back to first class, his strides slow but purposeful. Passengers followed him with their eyes, more curious now than ever. Rachel quickly busied herself with the service cart, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Murmurs began to ripple through the cabin almost immediately. "Do you think they know each other?" A man whispered to his seatmate. "Maybe he's her boss," someone else chimed in. Whoever he is, he didn't look happy about how she was treated. The speculation spread like wildfire. Rachel, now painfully aware of every glance and hushed voice, felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Gripping the handle of the cart tighter than necessary, she hurried it toward the galley, seeking the temporary refuge of the small, confined space. At the back of the plane, Elena sat calmly, her gaze drifting toward the window. On the surface, she appeared untouched by the attention. Yet, deep in her eyes, there was a flicker of quiet satisfaction, an awareness that the tide of the moment was shifting in her favor. She fastened her seatbelt, her movements slow and deliberate, as though bracing for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, the man in the charcoal suit returned to his seat in first class. Though he said nothing, his presence alone altered the atmosphere. Passengers who had been casually curious now exchanged knowing looks, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Something far beyond a simple seating dispute. Rachel's moment of solitude in the galley was brief. She busied herself preparing drinks, but her mind wandered, replaying the man's expression and Elena's unwavering calm. A soft knock at the galley door startled her. It was the co-pilot, leaning casually against the frame, his easy smile belying the sharp glint in his eyes. "Busy day?" he asked lightly. Rachel forced a polite smile, though her heart wasn't in it. "Just the usual," she replied, though her voice betrayed a slight edge. The co-pilot tilted his head, studying her for a beat longer than necessary. "You know," he said, his tone dropping slightly, "I couldn't help but notice earlier, the situation with the woman you moved." Rachel's stomach twisted, her fingers tightened around the coffee pot she was holding. "What about it?" she asked, a little too quickly. The co-pilot shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It's not really my business," he said, glancing briefly toward the first-class cabin, "but she's not just any passenger." Rachel's heart skipped. "What do you mean by that?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The co-pilot's eyes flickered toward the man in the suit. "You'll figure it out soon enough," he replied cryptically. With that, he straightened and disappeared back into the cockpit, leaving Rachel alone with her growing sense of dread. At the back of the plane, Elena's gaze drifted over the expanse of clouds outside the window. Her reflection ghosted faintly against the glass. Calm but thoughtful, she had long since learned that patience was a quiet but powerful ally. And now, she could feel it, the tension gathering like distant thunder. Rachel returned to her duties, but she found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The co-pilot's words echoed in her head, and her eyes kept straying toward the man in the front. He sat relaxed, sipping his drink as if nothing were amiss. Occasionally, he glanced down the aisle toward Elena, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Despite his calm, Rachel felt a weight settle in her chest. Passengers, on the other hand, seemed more animated. Whispers had evolved into full-fledged speculation. Those seated near Elena stole glances at her, though she paid them no mind. Her focus remained fixed on the clouds. If anything, her serenity only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Up front, the man eventually set his phone down on the tray table. With a casual motion, he pressed the call button above his seat. Rachel's breath caught when she saw the light illuminate. Another flight attendant started toward him, but the man raised his hand, stopping her. "I'd like to speak with her," he said evenly, nodding toward Rachel. Her pulse quickened as she smoothed the front of her uniform and made her way to his seat, plastering a polite smile across her face. But it felt more like a fragile mask than an expression of genuine warmth. "How can I assist you, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man regarded her in silence for a long moment, his gaze unreadable yet piercing. Finally, he gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Please," he said, his tone firm but calm, "have a seat." Rachel hesitated, glancing nervously down the aisle. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not allowed to," he interrupted gently, though his voice left little room for argument. "It's important." Reluctantly, Rachel sat, her posture stiff, as a few passengers discreetly leaned in, eager to catch whatever fragments of the exchange they could. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to command attention. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his gaze steady. Rachel's confidence faltered. She blinked, searching for words that wouldn't come. I'm not sure," she stammered. A faint, humorless smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'm Daniel Carrington," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm the CEO of Atlantic Skies." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her face paled as the realization sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing emerged. Her mind reeled, replaying every detail of her interaction with Elena, the quiet dismissal, the assumptions. Panic surged in her chest as the full weight of her mistake pressed down. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his expression cool and unreadable, though his eyes remained sharp. "The woman you moved to the back," he continued, his voice measured. "That's my wife." Rachel felt the words strike like a physical blow. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of her apron. She struggled to formulate a response, but Daniel raised a hand, cutting her off before she could begin. "I don't need explanations," he said coldly. "I need accountability." The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. Passengers near the front exchanged wide-eyed glances, while those further back strained to catch a glimpse of what was unfolding. Rachel swallowed hard, nodding shakily. "I'm so sorry, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize. Daniel's gaze didn't soften. That's the problem, he replied, his voice quieter but no less authoritative. You didn't realize because you didn't care to look past your assumptions. Rachel's eyes burned, tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them away and forced herself to meet his gaze. Daniel studied her for a moment longer. A hint of disappointment flickered in his eyes. Steady, unwavering. You're fortunate, he said finally, his tone softening just slightly. My wife is far more gracious than most. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Rachel remained seated, her head spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. After a moment, she rose, her movements stiff and mechanical. She retreated toward the galley, each step heavier than the last as the weight of the encounter settled deep into her chest. Whispers and lingering stares followed her down the aisle, a constant reminder of the mark this flight would leave. At the rear of the plane, Elena sat quietly by the window, gazing out at the sky. A soft smile tugged at her lips as she watched Daniel return to his seat. She didn't need to say a word. The shift in the air spoke for itself. The quiet dignity she carried from the beginning now stood as a silent beacon for everyone who had witnessed the moment. Rachel stood in the galley, her hands trembling as she poured water into a cup she had no intention of drinking. Her mind replayed the conversation over and over, each detail sharper than the last. How could I have been so blind? Her breath grew shallow as she leaned against the counter, desperate to steady herself. Tears threatened, but she fought to keep them at bay. In the cabin, Elena remained poised, her face betraying no hint of triumph. She seemed more interested in the clouds outside than the quiet storm that had passed through the plane. The passengers around her, however, saw things differently. Whispers ebbed and flowed, some glancing at Elena with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Others cast cautious glances toward the front, where Daniel sat calmly as if nothing had occurred. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Elena, clearing his throat. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, lowering his voice. "I just wanted to say it's remarkable how calm you've been through all of this." Elena turned to him, her gaze soft yet steady. "Thank you," she replied simply, her tone warm but reserved. The man hesitated, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. "I don't mean to pry, but you're married to him, aren't you? The man in first class?" Elena nodded once, her faint smile deepening. "I am," the man exhaled, shaking his head in quiet amazement. "And you didn't say anything when the flight attendant, when she asked you to move?" Elena's eyes shifted to her hands resting gently in her lap. Her voice, calm and unwavering, filled the space between them. "There's more power in staying silent," she said. "Sometimes letting others reveal who they are says more than words ever could." The man leaned back, thoughtful. He studied Elena with newfound respect, nodding slowly. "You're a better person than most," he said quietly. Rachel emerged from the galley, her steps hesitant and unsure. The tray of drinks in her hands felt heavier than usual, her confidence replaced by a quiet vulnerability that she couldn't disguise. Her eyes swept over the cabin nervously, searching for reassurance that wouldn't come. As she passed Elena's row, Rachel's hand faltered. She stopped, her face pale, lips parting as if to speak, though no words escaped. Elena lifted her gaze, meeting Rachel's with an expression impossible to read. The air between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. At last, Rachel found her voice, though it trembled. I'm so sorry," she whispered. Elena held her stare for a moment longer, her posture unwavering. Finally, she inclined her head, her voice soft but cutting through the silence like glass. "I hope you've learned something." The words weren't cruel, but they landed with undeniable force. Rachel nodded quickly, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Unable to hold back any longer, she turned and hurried down the aisle, leaving Elena to return her gaze to the window. At the front of the plane, Daniel sat calmly in first class, his phone in hand as he responded to emails. His focus had shifted, as though the earlier confrontation had already been catalogued and filed away in his mind. A flight attendant approached cautiously, her voice light but uncertain. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Carrington?" Daniel glanced up briefly, offering a polite smile and a small shake of his head. "No, thank you." She nodded and quickly retreated, sensing his desire for quiet. For the remainder of the flight, a soft undercurrent of reflection lingered over the cabin. Passengers who had previously been preoccupied with their own lives now seemed aware of Elena, of Daniel, and of the quiet but undeniable shift that had occurred. Some stole glances at Elena, others avoided her altogether, almost embarrassed to have been witnesses. But Elena remained as she had been from the start, graceful, poised, and unshaken. The plane continued its steady cruise at altitude, but the cabin had taken on a different atmosphere. Conversations were muted, the usual chatter replaced by a subdued calm that bordered on reverent. Elena sat quietly, her hands resting gently on the tray table, while Daniel remained composed a few rows ahead. And though few understood the full scope of what had transpired, everyone felt its weight. Rachel, still visibly shaken, busied herself with routine tasks, wiping down counters, rearranging service carts, anything to distract from the gnawing tension that followed her down the aisle. But she couldn't escape the quiet glances from passengers. Her usual confident stride had been replaced with something hesitant. Her head dipped slightly lower, as though burdened by the invisible weight of regret. Every step through the cabin felt like a reminder. A few rows ahead of Elena, a young woman leaned toward her travel companion, lowering her voice behind a cupped hand. "She's his wife," the woman murmured, wide-eyed. "The CEO's wife." Her companion's eyes widened, darting between Elena and the front of the plane. "I can't believe that flight attendant treated her like that," she whispered back. "It's embarrassing." Elena, hearing the murmurs but choosing not to react, shifted slightly in her seat. Her fingers grazed the edge of the tray table, but her gaze remained outward, fixed on the clouds beyond the glass. She had no desire to explain herself. She had learned long ago that strength didn't lie in grand displays or loud defenses. It lay in restraint. At the front, Daniel's gaze flicked across the cabin with deliberate care. He took in the small details, the nervous way Rachel moved, the restless fidgeting of passengers, and the serene stillness of Elena, a quiet anchor amidst it all. It was something Daniel had always admired about her, the way she could hold space and attention without uttering a word, how she could transform discomfort into a quiet lesson that lingered far beyond the moment. Rachel eventually found herself near Elena's row again, serving drinks to a passenger just 2 seats ahead. Her tray trembled slightly in her hands. She hesitated, but unable to suppress the guilt pressing on her chest, Rachel stopped at Elena's side. The weight of the moment unbearable. "Ma'am?" Rachel's voice broke softly, barely more than a breath. "I know I've already said it, but I need to apologize again." Elena turned toward her, her expression calm but inscrutable. Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes pleading. "I was wrong. I judged you based on assumptions." Rachel's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I acted without thinking. It was disrespectful, and I know I can't undo it, but I will do better. I promise." Elena's gaze softened, though only slightly. "Apologies are a start," she replied gently, though there was a quiet firmness beneath her words. "But change is what matters." Rachel nodded quickly, her eyes shimmering with the weight of the moment. She lingered as if waiting for something more, but Elena had already turned her attention back to the window, signaling the conversation was over. Rachel stepped away, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. There was work to be done, work that extended far beyond this flight. In first class, Daniel Carrington glanced at his watch. The flight was beginning its descent, but his attention wasn't on the time. His focus remained on Elena. He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She had handled everything exactly as he had expected, gracefully, with unwavering strength and a quiet wisdom that left a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. Daniel drew in a deep breath, pride swelling in his chest. But it wasn't pride in their connection, in the fact that Elena was his wife. It was pride in who she was, in the person she had always been. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. A ripple of activity stirred through the cabin, gently breaking the spell of silence that had lingered. For most passengers, the flight was simply reaching its conclusion. But for Rachel, Elena, and Daniel, the journey carried a weight that wouldn't end once the wheels touched the ground. The plane began its gradual descent, a soft hum of the engines vibrating through the cabin. Rachel straightened her uniform and focused on her remaining tasks, but her mind drifted. Elena's words echoed in her head. pressing down on her like a quiet but undeniable force. Around her, passengers stretched and began packing away books and devices, readying themselves for arrival. The usual routine filled the air, but the weight of reflection hadn't entirely lifted. Elena, ever composed, carefully tucked a small book into her bag and gazed out at the sky as it shifted into the city skyline. She didn't need to look around to feel the lingering glances. Daniel sat fully upright now, his focus briefly flickering toward Rachel. He raised his hand slightly, signaling for a flight attendant. Rachel froze for half a breath. But it wasn't her who approached. A younger, eager attendant responded, moving toward him quickly. She leaned in as Daniel spoke in a low voice, nodding several times before stepping away toward the cockpit. Rachel watched from the corner of her eye, feeling the familiar drop of dread in her stomach. She couldn't hear what Daniel had said, but something about his calm authority left little doubt in her mind. Steps were being taken. Rachel tried to focus, but the weight of the moment clung to her. Whatever those steps were, she knew the consequences were inevitable. The plane descended smoothly, the outline of the city growing sharper beneath them. The captain's voice came on again, reminding passengers to prepare for landing. Elena fastened her seatbelt with the same calm, deliberate precision she had carried throughout the flight. From across the cabin, she felt Daniel's eyes on her. But she didn't turn. There was no need. Their bond, steady and unspoken, was more than enough. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, the plane gradually slowed, passengers stirring in their seats as the journey came to an end. For many, the tension dissolved as they gathered their belongings. But for a few key individuals, the weight lingered. When the plane came to a complete stop, Rachel moved to her position at the front of the cabin, ready to assist with disembarking. She tried to project professionalism, but her movements felt rigid, and her face betrayed the unease simmering beneath the surface. The door creaked open, and the first-class passengers began to collect their bags. Daniel rose from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention as he reached for his briefcase. He exchanged a few quiet words with a fellow passenger, his voice low and polite. As he moved toward the aisle, Rachel held her breath. Her hands gripped the back of a seat to steady herself, though her pulse quickened when Daniel approached. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't glance in her direction. But his presence alone sent a shiver through her, as if a silent message had passed between them. Rachel exhaled slowly, but the moment wasn't over yet. Daniel continued down the aisle toward the rear of the plane, toward Elena. As the final row ahead cleared, Daniel's demeanor shifted. His intense, watchful expression softened into something warmer. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand toward Elena. Elena met his gaze, a quiet, knowing smile tugging at her lips. She took his hand, rising gracefully from her seat. Even in the simple act of standing, her poise was unmistakable. As they began moving toward the front of the plane, whispers stirred once again, but neither Elena nor Daniel paid them any mind. They walked side by side, unfazed by the curious glances trailing behind them. When they passed Rachel, Elena's eyes flicked toward her for a brief second. She offered the faintest nod, an acknowledgement, but nothing more. Daniel didn't spare Rachel a glance. His focus remained entirely on Elena, and that, more than any words, conveyed the message. Elena's quiet grace had left a deeper impression than any reprimand ever could. And Daniel's silence? That was his way of letting Rachel sit with the weight of her actions. As the couple stepped off the plane and disappeared into the terminal, their presence lingered like an echo through the cabin. For Rachel, the empty aisle felt cold, a stark reminder of what had been lost. It wasn't just the respect of a powerful figure, it was the missed opportunity to extend kindness, dignity, and respect when it mattered most. The lesson was clear. But the cost of learning, it was something Rachel knew she wouldn't soon forget. As the plane slowly emptied, row by row, Rachel remained at the front, greeting passengers with a forced smile. Her posture was rigid, and every polite, "Thank you for flying with us," felt heavier than the last. She felt their glances, brief but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Each one pricked at her skin like needles. Rachel wanted nothing more than for the flight to end, but the moments stretched on endlessly. At the rear of the plane, Elena rose with her usual elegance, gathering her belongings with quiet precision. Daniel stood beside her, his presence steady amidst the shifting energy of passengers trying to disembark. As Elena slipped her handbag over her shoulder, she cast a brief glance toward the seat she had occupied. A small, reflective smile appeared, a fleeting expression, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a depth of meaning. Daniel caught it. Leaning in slightly, he spoke in a low, intimate tone. "What's on your mind?" Elena turned toward him, her expression serene but unreadable. "Just thinking," she replied simply. "About people and the choices they make." Daniel nodded knowingly and offered his arm. Elena took it gently, and together they walked toward the front of the plane. The cabin, now nearly empty, felt different. Only a few passengers remained, struggling with overhead luggage. Those who lingered watched the couple quietly, their curiosity palpable. But Elena and Daniel ignored the lingering stares, their bond forming an invisible shield between them and the world around them. As they approached the front of the cabin, Rachel felt her heart begin to race. She sensed their presence before they even reached her, their calm footsteps seemingly amplifying the tension in the air. Rachel rehearsed words in her head, scrambling to find the perfect apology. But every version she formed sounded hollow, lacking the weight to match the moment. By the time Elena and Daniel stopped in front of her, Rachel felt like the floor beneath her feet might give way. Elena's eyes met Rachel's, calm yet unrelenting. The silence stretched just long enough for Rachel to feel the full weight of it. Unable to bear it any longer, Rachel's voice broke the quiet. "Mrs. Carrington, I truly want to apologize," Rachel blurted, her voice trembling. "For everything, for how I treated you." Daniel remained silent, his eyes fixed on Rachel, but his expression remained unreadable. Elena, however, tilted her head slightly, a flicker of quiet contemplation in her gaze. "Do you know what you're apologizing for, Rachel?" she asked softly, though there was a sharpness beneath the calm. Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the question. She nodded quickly, words tumbling out in nervous bursts. "Yes, ma'am. I shouldn't have judged you. I shouldn't have made assumptions or treated you differently. I wasn't professional, and I know I was wrong." Elena studied her for a moment longer, her eyes piercing through Rachel's flimsy words. "It's not just about professionalism," Elena said finally. "It's about respect, and that's something we owe to everyone, regardless of what we think we know about them." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her composure beginning to slip. "I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I really do, and I promise I'll do better." Elena's gaze softened slightly, though the weight in her eyes never fully lifted. "Good," she replied simply. Elena's calm gaze lingered on Rachel for just a moment longer before she spoke softly. "I hope you do." Daniel, who had been silent until now, finally addressed Rachel. His voice was even, yet carried the weight of quiet authority. "Rachel," he said, "I believe my wife has shown you more grace than most would in your position. Take this as a chance to reflect and grow. Not everyone is willing to teach through kindness." Rachel's face flushed as she lowered her gaze, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of her uniform. "Yes, sir. Thank you," she managed, barely above a whisper. Elena and Daniel stepped past her, walking toward the jet bridge. The murmurs of nearby passengers followed them, filling the air with quiet speculation. By now, many on the flight had pieced together who Elena was, and more importantly, who Daniel was. As the couple entered the terminal, the whispers only grew louder, but Elena and Daniel seemed untouched by the attention. Their pace was steady, their bond evident in the quiet way they moved together. Outside, a sleek black car waited for them on the tarmac, the driver already standing by to greet them. Daniel opened the door, guiding Elena inside before slipping in beside her. As the door shut behind them, the noise of the terminal faded, replaced by the soft hum of the city beyond. Daniel rested his hand lightly on hers. "You handled that beautifully," he said, admiration lacing his voice. Elena glanced at him with a soft smile. "Sometimes people need to see their actions reflected back at them," she replied. "It's the only way they truly understand." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "True, but it takes strength to teach through grace instead of anger." Elena turned her gaze toward the window as the car began to move, her thoughts briefly drifting back to the flight. There was no lingering resentment, no trace of frustration. Those emotions she knew would serve no purpose. Instead, there was only quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing her actions had left an imprint, not just on Rachel, but on the passengers who had silently observed it all. As the city skyline began to rise in the distance, Elena relaxed into her seat, her hand still resting gently in Daniel's. The day had been long, and the experience unexpected, but she knew one truth without doubt. Respect and dignity had the power to change the world, even in the smallest moments. The car weaved through the bustling streets, the golden hue of the evening sun painting long shadows across the buildings. Elena leaned her head against the seat, her eyes softly scanning the world beyond the tinted glass. Though her expression remained calm, her mind lingered on the flight, on Rachel, and the subtle but powerful exchange that had taken place thousands of feet in the air. Would Rachel remember the lesson, or would it fade with the rush of daily life? Daniel seemed to sense her thoughts. Without a word, he reached for her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers before interlocking them. "She'll remember," Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence with quiet certainty. Elena turned to him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Do you really think so?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Moments like that don't just disappear. They leave marks, sometimes small, sometimes life-changing, but they stay with you." Elena studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. Daniel's steady confidence was one of the things she admired most about him, a grounding force that balanced her quiet strength. She squeezed his hand lightly, allowing his words to settle over her like a comforting blanket. The car soon pulled into a circular driveway in front of a sleek, glass-walled building. It wasn't their home, but one of Daniel's private offices, a space where he often retreated for meetings away from the noise of his corporate headquarters. The driver stepped out, opening Daniel's door first. Daniel exited smoothly, turning to offer Elena his hand. Elena stepped out with quiet grace, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she took in their surroundings. The building's reflective glass shimmered under the evening light, the distant hum of the city a gentle reminder of the world still moving around them. Inside, the atmosphere was cool and quiet, the faint hum of air conditioning the only sound. A staff member greeted them and guided the couple toward a private lounge. The room was tastefully decorated, plush seating, soft lighting, and large windows offering a sweeping view of the city below. On a low table sat a tray of refreshments, beside it, a folder marked with the airline's logo. Daniel gestured for Elena to sit, settling beside her as he placed the folder between them. "I had this prepared earlier," he said, tapping the folder lightly. "I wanted to go over it with you before moving forward." Elena arched an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her gaze as she opened the folder. Her eyes moved steadily over the neatly organized documents inside. It was an internal report, pages filled with employee feedback and customer complaints from across the airline. As she read, her expression shifted to something more thoughtful. Patterns were beginning to emerge, gaps in training, lapses in service, and a troubling number of incidents similar to what had unfolded on their flight. "It's systemic," Elena said finally, closing the folder and meeting Daniel's eyes. "This isn't just about one mistake or one employee. It's a culture that allows these assumptions to take root and thrive." Daniel nodded, his face serious. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why I wanted your perspective. You've always had a way of seeing things others miss." Elena leaned back, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder as she considered his words. "It's not enough to address isolated incidents," she said thoughtfully. "You have to dig deeper, rethink how employees are trained, how they understand the importance of treating people with respect. It can't just be policy on paper. It has to be embedded in the culture." Daniel watched her, admiration clear in his eyes. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say," he admitted. "I've already arranged a meeting with the executive team. I want you to be there." Elena blinked in surprise. "Me? Why?" Daniel's voice softened, but his answer was clear. "Because you're the best example of what I want this company to represent. Your grace, your strength, the way you handled today, it's exactly the kind of leadership I want our team to reflect. You don't just talk about respect, Elena. You live it." A warmth spread through Elena's chest, a blend of pride and humility she hadn't expected. She could see the sincerity in Daniel's eyes. This wasn't about her being his wife. He was asking her to step into a leadership role, not as a favor, but as someone he believed could help shape the future of the company. Elena nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." Daniel's relief was visible in the way his shoulders relaxed, the gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you," he said quietly. They sat in silence for a few moments, gazing out at the city lights twinkling beyond the lounge windows. It was a peaceful, reflective quiet, one that carried the weight of possibility and the subtle stirrings of change. Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the lessons of that flight wouldn't end when they stepped off the plane. They would ripple outward, shaping not just Rachel but the culture of the airline, and perhaps beyond. As they left the lounge and returned to the waiting car, Elena carried that quiet sense of fulfillment with her. The journey wasn't over, but she felt ready for whatever came next. Beside her, Daniel remained a steady and reassuring presence, their shared sense of purpose binding them closer together. Together, they were ready to transform the small spark of that lesson into a flame that could illuminate the way forward for others. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Daniel's private conference room, casting long beams across the polished table at the center. Elena stood by the window, gazing down at the bustling city below. The faint hum of traffic and distant office chatter created a quiet sense of anticipation. Today's meeting wasn't just another corporate initiative. It was about addressing something deeper, the systemic cracks that had surfaced during their flight. For Elena, this was more than just a discussion. It was a chance to bring her perspective into a space where it could spark real, lasting change. Daniel entered the room, a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm. He paused in the doorway for a moment, watching Elena as she stood in the sunlight. "Nervous?" he asked playfully, his tone warm. Elena turned slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not nervous," she replied. "Just thinking." Daniel placed the coffee and folder on the table before stepping beside her. "Thinking about what?" Elena's gaze drifted back toward the city. "About how change begins," she said quietly. "It's rarely easy, and it's almost never comfortable. But if you do it right, it sticks." Daniel nodded, his respect for her evident in the way he looked at her. "That's why you're here," he said softly. "You see things clearly, and you're not afraid to speak up. That's exactly what this company needs." Soon, the room began to fill as members of the executive team arrived, their quiet chatter fading as they took their seats. Some glanced curiously at Elena, offering polite nods. Others exchanged more formal greetings with Daniel as they settled in. But, as they sat around the table, there was an unspoken awareness that today's meeting wasn't just another briefing. It was the start of something different. When everyone had settled, Daniel stood at the head of the table. His commanding presence quieted the low hum of conversation. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Today's meeting isn't about quarterly performance or financial targets. It's about culture. How we define it, how we live it, and where we fall short." His gaze drifted toward Elena, offering a small nod before continuing. "Yesterday, on one of our flights, my wife and I witnessed something that highlights an issue we've been discussing for some time. The way passengers and employees are treated isn't just about following policy. It's about respect and dignity in every interaction." The room fell silent, Daniel's words settling over the table with weight. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in quiet agreement. Daniel gestured toward Elena. "This is Elena Carrington. Many of you know her as my wife. But today, I want you to hear from her as someone who brings valuable insight into what happened and what we need to address moving forward." Elena stood with ease, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her calm confidence seemed to radiate as she glanced briefly around the room, making deliberate eye contact with several executives. "Thank you for having me," she began, her voice warm but resolute. "I'm not here to criticize or point fingers. I'm here to share a perspective, a reminder of how powerful respect can be and how damaging its absence is." She recounted the events on the flight with measured precision, describing the interaction with Rachel, the flight attendant, without bitterness but with clarity. Elena spoke not just of the personal slight, but of the larger issue, how unchecked assumptions, no matter how small, could erode the foundation of trust and integrity within an organization. Her words were direct but delivered with grace, making even the most defensive listeners reflect rather than resist. "It's not just about following rules," Elena said, her gaze steady as it swept across the table. "It's about understanding why those rules exist. It's about teaching empathy, encouraging awareness, and holding ourselves accountable when we fall short." A hush settled over the room as she concluded, the weight of her message hanging in the air like a quiet challenge. Daniel stepped forward once more, his expression unwavering. "Elena is absolutely right," he said. "We can't allow complacency or unexamined biases to dictate our company's culture. Starting today, we'll be reassessing our training programs, redefining core values, and setting higher expectations for ourselves and for everyone who represents Atlantic Skies." He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on each executive. "I expect each of you to lead by example," Daniel added. "This isn't about surface-level change, it's about living those values every day." Some executives nodded enthusiastically, others absorbed his words more quietly. But the message was clear. This was more than just another corporate initiative. It was a shift in the foundation of the company itself. When the meeting concluded, several executives approached Elena, expressing gratitude for her perspective and offering their support. Elena accepted their words with humility, though she understood the real work was just beginning. As the room gradually emptied, Daniel stepped to her side, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You were incredible," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Elena smiled faintly, humility tempering her confidence. "This is just the beginning," she replied. "Real change will come from what happens next." Daniel nodded knowingly. "You're right, but today was an important step." Together, they left the conference room, their shared vision clear. They were ready to turn the spark of transformation into something that would ripple far beyond the walls of the company. In the weeks that followed, Atlantic Skies underwent a quiet but profound transformation. It began with subtle yet meaningful shifts in communication, employee engagement, and how feedback was handled. Elena's insights had sparked not just conversations but real action. And with Daniel ensuring accountability at every level, those actions began to take root. Together, they worked behind the scenes, their partnership just as seamless in the professional world as it was in their personal lives. The first major initiative focused on employee training. Rachel's incident wasn't used to single her out, but rather as a case study, one that highlighted the impact of unconscious bias and the power of humility in leadership. The training sessions went beyond the typical corporate presentations. They were immersive, interactive, and rooted in personal stories like Elena's. Stories that humanized the lessons and underscored the importance of empathy. Elena didn't just oversee the training. She participated. She sat alongside flight attendants, ground crew, and administrative staff, engaging in conversations and answering questions. Her presence left an impression. Employees who might have dismissed the program as another corporate directive began to lean in, realizing that the message came from a place of authenticity. Rachel attended one of the sessions, sitting quietly in the back. Her posture was different now, more reflective, more open, and as Elena spoke at the front of the room, Rachel listened closely, the weight of her own experience grounding her in a way no training manual ever could. Elena had insisted on being part of the initial rollout, not as a symbolic figurehead, but as an active participant. She sat alongside flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew members, engaging with them directly. Her calm, attentive presence left a mark. Employees who might have dismissed the sessions as another forgettable corporate directive leaned in, captivated by the sincerity of her words and the gravity of her experiences. One session in particular stood out. It took place in a modest training room at one of Northwind Airlines' regional hubs, a space far removed from the sleek boardrooms of Daniel's headquarters. The room was filled with employees, many of whom had never met Daniel or Elena in person. Rachel sat near the back, her posture stiff but her focus unwavering. She had requested to attend, not out of obligation, but as a personal step toward redemption. As the session began, the trainer, an expert in workplace culture, introduced Elena and gave her the floor. Elena rose, her poise and warmth filling the room as she stood at the front. She began to share her story once more, but this time, her words carried a different weight. She wasn't just someone who had experienced a moment of disrespect, she was someone who believed deeply in the potential for change. "What I want you to understand," Elena said, her voice steady and clear, "is that every interaction you have carries weight. It's not just about following policies or doing your job, it's about the impact you leave behind. Every passenger, every colleague, every stranger. How you treat them matters." She paused, letting the words linger in the air before continuing. "We all make mistakes. I'm not here to judge anyone for that. What defines us isn't the mistake itself, it's how we respond, how we grow from it." Rachel shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes fixed on Elena. The words resonated deeply, stirring something within her. Her expression reflected a mix of reflection and quiet determination. As Elena wrapped up her talk, she opened the floor for questions, encouraging dialogue. There was hesitation at first, but soon hands began to rise. The room buzzed with discussions about real challenges, about practical solutions, about the path forward. When the session ended, employees lined up to thank Elena personally. Their gratitude was evident, reflected in their voices and expressions. Rachel lingered near the back of the line, waiting until most of the others had left before approaching. She stopped in front of Elena, her hands clasped tightly and her eyes a mixture of guilt and hope. "Mrs. Carrington," Rachel began, her voice trembling slightly, I don't know how to thank you, not just for forgiving me, but for everything you've done since then. You didn't have to, but you did." Elena studied Rachel for a long moment. Then a soft, kind smile crossed her lips. "You're here," Elena said simply. "That tells me you've already started to grow. Keep going." Rachel nodded, tears threatening to spill as she whispered, "I will." As Rachel turned to leave, Daniel entered the room, having arrived toward the end of the session. He watched as small groups of employees lingered, discussing what they had learned. There was an energy in the room, hopeful, determined. Daniel turned to Elena, his expression filled with quiet admiration. "You're making waves," he said softly. Elena shrugged, a playful glint in her eye. "Maybe," she replied, "but this isn't about me, it's about them. They're the ones who will carry it forward." Daniel nodded, slipping an arm gently around her waist as they began to walk toward the exit. "True," he agreed, "but they wouldn't be doing it without you." As the couple walked through the hub, curious but respectful glances followed them. Employees whispered quietly, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of respect that Elena's presence commanded. For Elena, the transformation she had set in motion wasn't just about policies or training. It was about reshaping the culture from within, one person at a time. Later that evening, as they sat on the balcony of their home, the city lights twinkled in the distance. Daniel raised his glass of wine, a faint smile curling at his lips. "To the quiet revolution," he said. Elena laughed softly, clinking her glass gently against his. "To respect and dignity," she replied, "and to the courage it takes to make them real." As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the city below blending into the stillness of the evening. Their connection, steady and unshakable, remained the foundation of everything they had built, and everything they still hoped to achieve. The lessons Elena and Daniel had carried forward began to ripple far beyond that single flight. They both knew the journey of change was far from over, but they were prepared to see it through, step by step, moment by moment, until the ripples became a tide. As months passed, the transformations Elena and Daniel had set in motion spread across Northwind Airlines and beyond. What had begun as a quiet moment of dignity at 30,000 feet evolved into something larger, a catalyst that reshaped not just company policies, but the very attitudes and behaviors of employees at every level. The story of Elena's calm strength and Daniel's unwavering leadership circulated widely. It became a cornerstone case study in corporate training programs and even found its way into viral social media threads. But for Elena and Daniel, it was never about public recognition. It was about creating meaningful, lasting change, the kind that wasn't seen in headlines, but felt in the daily lives of those they impacted. At the heart of this transformation was the human element, a new initiative spearheaded by Elena and fully supported by Daniel's executive team. The initiative focused on empathy, cultural awareness, and active listening. Its mission was simple yet profound: rebuild trust and foster a culture of respect. One conversation, one decision, and one interaction at a time. Elena worked closely with a diverse team to develop workshops, panel discussions, and mentorship programs for employees across departments. The goal wasn't just to teach, it was to inspire. One of the most visible changes came during the airline's annual employee conference. Held at a sprawling convention center, the event brought together thousands of staff, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, executives, and administrative workers. The energy in the room was electric. Conversations buzzed with anticipation as employees gathered to hear from the woman who had become an unspoken symbol of Northwind's new direction. When Elena stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. She stood calmly, letting the sound fill the space before raising a hand in quiet gratitude. The room gradually fell silent, and Elena began to speak. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and warm. "It's humbling to stand here today, but I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about how we show up for one another, how we choose to see each other, and how we decide to treat the world around us." She let her words settle over the audience before continuing. "When I think about respect, I don't picture grand gestures or complex policies. I think about the small moments, the times when we choose kindness, when we listen, or when we extend grace. Those moments may seem insignificant, but they're the building blocks of something much greater." Elena once again recounted the story of the flight. This time, the focus wasn't on what had happened to her, but on the lessons it revealed. The power of humility, the importance of accountability, and the ability to grow from mistakes. She spoke about Rachel, not as an adversary, but as a person who had made a misstep and chosen to rise above it. Her words resonated deeply, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. As she concluded, Elena left the audience with a simple yet powerful challenge. Tomorrow, when you go back to work, ask yourself this: how can I make someone's day better? It might be a passenger, a colleague, or even a stranger you pass by. But whoever it is, choose kindness. Choose respect. Because those small choices, as simple as they seem, are the foundation of a better world. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation, the sound sweeping across the room like a wave. Elena stood humbly, her heart full as she absorbed the moment. From the front row, Daniel watched, pride clear in his eyes. He knew this moment wasn't just the result of months of work. It was a celebration of who Elena had always been. After the conference, Elena and Daniel mingled with employees, listening to their stories and hearing firsthand how the changes had impacted their lives. Amid the crowd, Rachel appeared, her posture taller, her expression bright and confident, so different from the hesitant woman Elena had once met in the galley. She approached with a warm, genuine smile. "Mrs. Carrington," Rachel began, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, not just for forgiving me, but for giving me the opportunity to do better." Elena returned the smile, warmth in her eyes. Elena's expression softened as she met Rachel's eyes. "You don't have to thank me," Elena said gently. "You're the one who chose to change. That's all you." Rachel nodded, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Still, I'll always remember what you taught me." As the evening came to a close, Elena and Daniel found themselves alone on the rooftop terrace of the convention center. The city stretched out beneath them, the glow of lights flickering like stars. They stood in quiet reflection, side by side, as the cool night breeze brushed past them. Daniel broke the silence first. "Do you think it will last?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the skyline. Elena turned to him, her smile calm but certain. "It already has," she replied. "This isn't about perfection, Daniel. It's about progress. As long as people are willing to try, change will always be possible." Daniel slid his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "You've done something remarkable, Elena. Something most people wouldn't even dare to attempt." Elena laughed softly, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "We did it together," she corrected, "and we're far from finished." They stood quietly for a moment longer, taking in the view, the hum of the city below reminding them of the countless lives moving forward, each one capable of the same quiet transformation. The journey they had started wasn't over. The work of building a more respectful, empathetic world was continuous. But they were ready to keep pushing forward, together. A single moment of injustice had blossomed into a movement for change, proving that even the smallest actions could have the most profound impact. And as they faced the future, their resolve was stronger than ever. Respect is the foundation of every meaningful interaction. It transcends appearances, titles, and assumptions. It is rooted in recognizing the shared humanity in everyone we encounter. True respect isn't passive. It's a choice, a conscious decision we make in the small moments of our daily lives. When we lead with empathy, we create bridges of trust and understanding that ripple far beyond what we can see. Mistakes are inevitable, but growth begins the moment we acknowledge them and choose to do better. In a world that often overlooks the power of grace, choosing kindness isn't just impactful, it's transformative. Respect is where real change begins, and that's the story. A reminder of how dignity, humility, and empathy can reshape the world, one interaction at a time. What did you think of this powerful story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.